They teach you that Edward VI died young, a sickly prince called too soon to God's embrace, a footnote in the Tudor dynasty, remembered more for what he might have been than what he endured. But they don't teach you about the screaming. They don't tell you about the mercury that corroded his organs from within, administered by royal physicians who believed they were saving him. They skip the part where England's golden prince spent his final months as a living corpse, his body rotting while he was still breathing, trapped in a gilded nightmare that would make medieval torture chambers seem merciful. What I'm about to tell you isn't just worse than they teach in history class. It's worse than most people can imagine. This is the story of how a 9-year-old boy was slowly murdered by the very people sworn to protect him, all while an entire kingdom celebrated his supposed health. This is the story of Edward VI and why his death was so horrific that it was systematically erased from history. Because when you're done listening to this, you'll understand why they had to lie. The truth was simply too monstrous to record. But what they couldn't have predicted was that the evidence would survive, hidden in private letters, coded physician reports, and diplomatic dispatches that paint a picture so disturbing it makes you question everything you thought you knew about royal power, medieval medicine, and human suffering. Let me start with something they definitely don't teach you. Edward VI was being poisoned from the moment he drew his first breath, and his own father ordered it. When Edward was born in 1537, Henry VIII had already destroyed 2 wives and split from Rome in his desperate quest for a male heir. This child wasn't just a son. He was England's entire future wrapped in swaddling clothes, and Henry was taking no chances. The royal nursery at Hampton Court became a fortress of paranoia. Every breath of air Edward inhaled was filtered through rosewater-soaked cloth. His milk was tested for poison before each feeding. His very sweat was analyzed by physicians for signs of corruption. But here's what they don't tell you about this supposed protection. It was slowly killing him. The physicians, operating under theories that would be laughable if they weren't so deadly, believed that Edward's delicate constitution required constant intervention. Dr. Butts, the king's own physician, prescribed a daily regimen of fortifying tonics that contained mercury, lead, and powdered pearls. They were literally feeding poison to an infant, convinced they were strengthening him. By the time Edward was 2, court observers noted his unnaturally pale skin and the way his blue veins showed through like rivers beneath parchment. The midwives who had attended his birth whispered about his translucent appearance, but these weren't signs of nobility. They were symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. The irony is staggering. Henry VIII, in his obsession with protecting his heir, created the very conditions that would destroy him. Every precaution became a step toward Edward's grave. The filtered air concentrated harmful vapors. The tested foods were supplemented with toxic medicines. The sterile environment weakened his natural immunity. But the most horrific part: Edward was bright enough to understand what was happening to him. Palace records show that by age 4, he would flinch when the physicians approached. He had learned to associate their presence with pain, their remedies with sickness. Yet he couldn't protest. Future kings don't complain about the very care designed to preserve them. The royal propaganda machine was already working overtime, describing Edward as thriving and robust, even as diplomatic reports noted his disturbing thinness and the strange, sickly sweet smell that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But this was only the beginning of Edward's nightmare, because as he grew older, the treatments would become exponentially more brutal. By the time Edward turned 6, the royal physicians had transformed healthcare into systematic torture, and they genuinely believed they were saving his life. Dr. Wendy, who became Edward's primary physician, subscribed to the medieval theory of humoral balance, the idea that illness came from an excess of blood, phlegm, black bile, or yellow bile. When Edward developed his first serious cough, Wendy's solution was to drain what he considered corrupted blood through controlled bleeding. But this wasn't the careful bloodletting you might imagine. Using primitive lancets, They carved deep gashes into Edward's arms, collecting bowls of blood that filled too quickly for a child his size. When the bleeding wouldn't stop naturally, they would cauterize the wounds with red-hot irons, leaving Edward's arms striped with burn scars. The smell of burning flesh became a regular feature of the royal apartments. When bleeding failed to cure his persistent cough, they escalated to leeches. Not the clean, medicinal leeches of modern medicine, but fat, diseased specimens pulled from Thames marshes. These parasites would be applied to Edward's chest, arms, and even inside his mouth, gorging themselves until they burst from overfeeding. Edward learned not to scream during these procedures. A Tudor prince didn't show weakness even when having his blood drained by creatures that left infected bite marks across his body. But the bloodletting was nothing compared to the purges. Convinced that Edward's system was full of corrupt humours, the physicians began forcing him to ingest massive doses of mercury, hellebore, and white arsenic, substances we now know are deadly poisons. The goal was to make him violently sick, expelling what they believed were toxins, but were actually his body's desperate attempts to survive. Edward would spend hours writhing in agony as these medicines burned through his digestive system. He would vomit until he could only retch air, his small body convulsing as it tried to expel the poison. The physicians took his suffering as proof that the treatments were working. The more he suffered, the more convinced they became that they were drawing out the corruption. The most horrifying detail comes from a coded letter written by Lady Bryan, Edward's head nurse. She describes finding Edward one morning, his sheets soaked with blood from both ends, too weak to lift his head, while Dr. Wendy prepared another dose of mercury, proclaiming that the corruption runs deep, but we shall triumph. Edward, at 7 years old, had learned to bite down on leather straps during treatments to keep from screaming. But his eyes, witnesses reported, held a knowledge that no child should possess. The understanding that the people sworn to heal him were slowly murdering him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The worst part is that Henry VIII saw all of this and approved. Every treatment required royal consent. Every escalation in brutality had the king's blessing, because admitting the physicians were wrong would mean admitting that his precious heir was dying, and Henry VIII was constitutionally incapable of accepting defeat. But Edward's body was beginning to rebel in ways that no amount of royal denial could hide. By 1546, 9-year-old Edward VI had become something that shouldn't exist, a walking corpse held together by willpower and the desperate delusions of his caretakers. The ulcers started as small sores on his arms where the bloodletting had been most frequent. Within weeks they had spread across his body like some medieval plague, weeping yellowish pus that stained his royal garments. The smell was indescribable. Witnesses compared it to rotting meat left in summer heat, so overwhelming that even the strongest incense couldn't mask it. But here's what makes this truly horrific. The court continued to function normally around Edward's decay. Ambassadors were brought to meet him, their faces carefully neutral as they tried not to recoil from the stench. Courtiers bowed to a child whose skin was literally falling off his bones. The Spanish envoy wrote in a coded dispatch that the prince appears to be decomposing while alive, yet all pretend normalcy. Edward's hair had begun falling out in clumps from the mercury poisoning. His fingernails turned black and brittle, his teeth loosened in his gums, and he could only eat liquids because solid food caused bleeding. Yet official portraits from this period show a healthy, rosy-cheeked boy, lies painted in oil and distributed across Europe to maintain the illusion of Tudor strength. The physicians, faced with undeniable evidence that their treatments were failing, doubled down with increasing desperation. They began applying caustic substances directly to the ulcers, believing they could burn away the corruption. Edward would be held down by 4 servants while they poured acid onto his open wounds, his muffled screams absorbed by the thick tapestries that lined his chambers. Dr. Butts wrote in his private notes that Edward had developed an unnatural odour of decay, and that the corruption appears to spread inward toward the vital organs. But instead of questioning their methods, they interpreted this as proof that more aggressive treatment was needed. The breaking point came during a state dinner in late 1546. Edward, dressed in padded clothing to hide his skeletal frame and doused in perfume to mask the smell, was required to appear before foreign dignitaries. Halfway through the meal, he began coughing, not the dry cough of illness, but a wet, tearing sound that brought up chunks of tissue. When he finally stopped, the silk handkerchief he held was soaked crimson. But it wasn't just blood. Witnesses later described seeing what appeared to be pieces of his lung. The French ambassador immediately excused himself and left England the next day, writing to his king that the Tudor heir is already dead. His body simply hasn't realized it yet. That night, Edward was heard speaking to his reflection in a mirror, asking it why it looked like a stranger. Lady Bryan found him trying to press the skin back onto his arms where the ulcers had eaten through to the muscle beneath. He was 9 years old, and he understood that he was rotting alive. The most heartbreaking detail comes from a letter Edward himself dictated to a scribe during a brief lucid moment. He wrote, "I know what they do to me. I know it hurts more than it helps. But I am to be king, so I must endure. I only pray that when I die, it will be quick." It wouldn't be. Because the worst was yet to come, and Edward's final days would make everything he had already endured seem merciful by comparison. January 1547 brought the death of Henry VIII, and with it, the end of any pretense that Edward VI was anything but a dying child playing king. What happened next represents one of the most callous examples of political expedience overriding human decency in English history. The Privy Council faced an impossible situation. Their king was a 10-year-old boy whose body was failing catastrophically, but admitting this would throw England into chaos. Their solution was to prop up Edward's corpse-like figure and continue the charade, no matter the cost, to the child himself. The regent, Edward Seymour, issued strict orders that Edward must appear publicly at least once a month to prove he was alive and capable of ruling. This meant that a child whose skin was peeling off, whose breath smelled of decay, and who could barely stand without support, was forced to perform the role of monarch for crowds who had no idea they were looking at a walking nightmare. The preparations for these appearances were themselves a form of torture. Servants would pack Edward's clothes with padding to disguise his skeletal frame. They painted his face with a mixture of crushed pearls and lead-based cosmetics that gave him the appearance of health while simultaneously poisoning him further. The irony is almost too much to bear. They were killing him to make him look alive. But the most horrific detail comes from the testimony of Edward's personal attendant, recorded years later. Before each public appearance, Edward would suffer what we now recognize as convulsions caused by the advanced toxicity in his system. His body would arch backward, his limbs would thrash uncontrollably, and he would make sounds like an animal caught in a trap. These seizures would last for up to an hour, leaving him barely conscious. Then they would dress him, paint him, and parade him before his subjects as the golden future of England. By the summer of 1552, Edward's condition had deteriorated beyond any possibility of concealment. The ulcers now covered most of his body, and the infection had spread internally. Contemporary accounts describe him as more skeleton than boy, with eyes so sunken they appeared to be staring out from a skull. The physicians, perhaps recognizing their failure, began experimenting with increasingly desperate measures. They tried trepanning, drilling holes in Edward's skull to release evil vapors. They applied hot coals to his feet to draw the corruption downward. They even attempted what can only be described as primitive chemotherapy, feeding him solutions of dissolved gold and silver. Each treatment was agony, each day was a new form of hell, and through it all, Edward was expected to study Latin, receive ambassadors, and make the decisions that would shape England's future. The final breaking point came in February 1553. During a council meeting, Edward collapsed mid-sentence, blood pouring from his mouth and nose, but instead of calling for medical help, the counsellor's first concern was whether anyone outside the room had heard him fall. They propped him back up in his chair, wiped the blood from his face, and continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. Edward sat there, semi-conscious and bleeding internally, while grown men debated tax policy around his dying form. That night, alone in his chambers, Edward finally found his voice. Palace guards reported hearing him scream, not the controlled whimpers of his treatments, but the raw, primal scream of a child who had endured more than any human being should have to bear. It was the last sound he would make with any strength, because what came next would rob him of even the ability to cry out in pain. July 6th, 1553. The day Edward VI died was not a peaceful passing. It was 6 hours of convulsions so violent that servants had to hold him down to prevent him from throwing himself from the bed. But here's what they don't teach you. Edward's death wasn't the end of the horror. It was the beginning of one of history's most successful cover-ups, a systematic erasure of truth so complete that we're still living with its consequences today. The moment Edward drew his last rattling breath, the machinery of Tudor propaganda swung into action. Within hours, every servant who had witnessed his suffering was either paid off, threatened, or quietly disappeared. The physicians' detailed notes documenting their treatments were seized and burned. Even the bed sheets, stiff with blood and pus, were destroyed as evidence. Dr. Butts, who had overseen years of Edward's torture, was found dead in his chambers 3 days later. Officially from grief, though contemporary sources suggest he may have been silenced to prevent him from recording the truth about what they had done to the prince. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, a vague term that revealed nothing about the years of systematic poisoning and medical torture. The royal embalmers, when they opened Edward's body, found organs so damaged by mercury and other toxins that they were reportedly unrecognizable as human. These findings were immediately classified and never recorded in any official document. But the most chilling aspect of the cover-up was how they rewrote Edward's story. Within a month of his death, court historians had created a completely fictional narrative. Edward the Scholar King, Edward the Pious Prince, Edward, who died peacefully in his sleep after a brief illness. They commissioned portraits showing him healthy and robust. They fabricated quotes about his wisdom and kindness. They even invented stories about his final moments, claiming he died while reciting prayers rather than convulsing in agony. This wasn't just propaganda, it was the wholesale manufacture of a lie, so convincing that it became historical fact. For over 400 years, Edward VI was remembered as the tragic young king who might have been great rather than the tortured child who was slowly murdered by the adults who claimed to love him. The consequences rippled through centuries of English history. Mary I's bloody persecution of Protestants was partly fueled by her rage at being denied access to her dying brother. Elizabeth VIII's famous virginity may have been influenced by witnessing what royal childbirth had cost her family. The entire Tudor obsession with control and secrecy can be traced back to the need to hide what they had done to Edward. But perhaps the most horrific revelation came from modern forensic analysis of Edward's surviving hair samples preserved in a locket given to his sister Mary. The mercury levels found were over 300 times what would be considered lethal today. The lead content was equally staggering. Edward VI didn't die from consumption, he died from systematic heavy metal poisoning that began before his first birthday and continued until his last breath. They had been murdering him slowly for his entire life, convinced they were saving him. The physicians who killed him were never held accountable. The system that enabled his torture continued unchanged, and the truth was buried so deeply that it took modern science to uncover the full extent of what was done to a child whose only crime was being born to be king. So when your history teacher tells you that Edward VI died young from illness, remember this: they're not just wrong about how he died, they're perpetuating a lie that was created to hide one of the most sustained acts of child abuse in recorded history. Edward VI didn't die from disease. He was murdered by medicine, tortured by those who claimed to heal him, and his suffering was so extreme that an entire government conspired to erase it from history. And they succeeded. Until now. The boy who should have been England's greatest king instead became the victim of its most carefully hidden crime. That's the truth they don't teach you in history class, because some truths are too horrific to face, too horrific to face, too horrific.